I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. My father escaped Armenia with his mother and his younger sister during the genocide. He was 5 years old, made it to France, where he lived in Marseille, spoke French and Armenian, and then was brought to the US. His father knew the genocide was about to happen, so he had left Armenia before a lot of the men in his village were killed. And he had created a home, and they were going to come, his wife and two children, but didn't make it till he was 17. He got thrown into Boston English High School without any English, and was excellent at math. In fact, he got into MIT, except that his father died when he was supposed to go, so instead he went to night school at Northeastern. And it was his experience as a young man, a young immigrant in this country, that he spoke about as I was growing up, and the experience of discrimination, a little bit about the genocide, but I got more about that from my great aunt, who was on one of those forced marches where most people died. She lost an eye. She saw unspeakably horrible things done to other people. And as someone who has so traumatized with what I know now to be PTSD, but when I was a kid around 8, 9, 10 years old, I didn't know that. She told me a lot of these things, and they were seared into my memory, into my mind, and I think it was the beginning of my developing tough skin on the one hand, but also a sense of the great need to bring about social justice in this world. Kindness, doing something about evil in the world. That, I grew up with an awareness that some horrible things were done to people. I was pretty young when I learned about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. I was deeply interested in these issues, and I worked, with inner city kids, and when I was in college, and I was interested in lots of different things, how people learned. I thought I might go to medical school. I actually took the MCATs, and I got derailed, actually, in this process of learning about many different things. Some people say I'm your typical Gemini, off in a million directions.
Well, let me go back a little bit to how old were you when you were hearing the stories from your aunt that you
I'm
recall?
not sure the actual age. I think I was as young as 8 or 9 years old when my great aunt began to tell me some of these horrible atrocities that she witnessed. She herself was made infertile by that whole experience of being on the forced march, and it was a source of great pain to her when she came to the States, got married, and never could have a child.
What were you thinking as an 8 or 9-year-old girl hearing these stories?
Well, it's an odd thing. I found it hard to believe. But when I was about 5 or 6, I asked my aunt, not my great aunt, a question about the birds and the bees. And I actually don't remember what the question was, but I remember she started telling me about how sex happened. And all I could think about was, I'd seen my father nude. That big thing fits into my little space. I didn't have this capacity to think about an older woman with a bigger vagina. So that to me seemed like a traumatic thing. Like, why would people have babies that way? That must hurt a lot. So I had all kinds of things told to me. And when I was 12 years old, one of my girlfriends and I discovered a marriage manual in her parents' bookshelf. We read the thing cover to cover. Huge amount about homosexuality, about sex, about making it work, things that I knew nothing about. Then my father gave me Marriage and Morals to read by Bertrand Russell when I was about 12. Now, that didn't go into any details about sex, but it did say things like people should live together before they get married so they know they'd really be good partners. A lot of good advice there. But this is not your typical bit of advice from an adult in that era. So this was 1960. So I had a father who, he'd read George Dewey, George Santayana. He'd read a lot of Bertrand Russell, and he was part philosopher. And even though he was an Armenian with a lot of conventional ideas that men have sometimes, he was a free thinker in other ways. And I think he opened, for me, the doors to thinking outside the box about everything.
Were you the only child in your experience, or young person in your experience with this situation, or this knowledge?
Yes and no. There were a few friends during my, say, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade period that I found who had parents a little bit forward-thinking, a little bit more like your New York beatnik type, who were giving their kids things to read and think about that weren't your standard fare. My mother was actually not conventional either, but I didn't appreciate it. She was raising 5 kids with very little help from my father in terms of the logistics. And she was someone I learned later had felt that had lost the opportunity to do what she really wanted to do, which actually was to go to medical school, but no young woman in her period was allowed, let alone a young Armenian woman in a traditional family, to go on and do any sort of advanced schooling. She was lucky to go to Franklin Institute in Pennsylvania and get a 2-year program and become a lab technician. She worked at Mass General Hospital and was interested in things medical, but that wasn't what she really wanted. And she became a member of the League of Women Voters. I must have been 7 or 8 when I was aware of that. So that was interesting to me. My mother was interested in politics, so I learned a little bit about that. I remember she liked Adlai Stevenson. I had no idea what that meant till years later, and I learned some things from history, and that said something to me about their general politics and views that I may not have appreciated.
How old were you when you learned of what you think is your mom's disappointment with what she was allowed to do with her life?
Probably a teenager, when she was saying things like, my life has revolved around the diaper pail for 12 years and, it's really restricted what I could do. And she often said, don't get married. She's not like your typical mother. She would say, don't get married, it's really hard raising kids, you can't do all these other things. That may have been the biggest mistake of my life. But there she was, a mother who loved 5 kids, and maybe my brother, who's the first one born, bore the brunt of her being unhappy with being a mother. The rest of us, I think we got unconditional love. I don't think he did in the early stages.
What number were you in the...
I was number 2.
Number 2, oldest girl.
I was the older of 2 girls. There were 3 boys and 2 girls in the family. And I did very well in school, and my father loved that I loved math, and I did problems with him, and I was on the math team in high school, and I was a valedictorian, and he was thrilled that I loved science and math. And in fact, when I first got to college, I thought I would major in math. Didn't happen, but I have to say that he was intellectually probably the most important influence on me. Yes, there were teachers, but he was consistently there. Even as I felt critical of the fact, he walked out the door to go play cards at the club in the night and didn't, help my mother with all the stuff around the house. On the other hand, this was a period that was conventional, There were many fathers who were the breadwinners, and mothers stayed at home. They didn't work outside the home. My mother didn't go back to being a lab technician until we were much older, and there weren't little kids around, needing a lot of attention.
You went to Radcliffe. What did you study there?
Well, when I went off to college, I thought I would major in math. I did, in fact, pursue organic chemistry my first year because I had taken a summer course, which was essentially the first year of chemistry at Harvard. It was Harvard summer school between my junior and senior years in high school. And I took calculus, and I was also in the orchestra. I played the cello, and I was, like many kids, torn and pulled in many different directions. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I got a crush on a TA for a philosophy course. I took a fabulous course in logic with John Rawls that I found fascinating. And because I got a crush on the TA, then I decided to major in philosophy, and I'm already in my junior year, and I've done a lot of different things. So in the end, I graduated with a degree in something called social relations. It's a mishmash and includes some anthropology, some sociology, some psychology. And it was a great liberal arts education, but it left me not sure exactly what I wanted to do. And within a year or 2 after I graduated college, I met some of the women who had produced the original newsprint edition of Our Bodies, Our Selves. This is before we incorporated and before we made the commercial edition for Simon & Schuster. And this group of women were so electrifying for me. I was the youngest woman in the group, but I knew this is a place I wanted to be. And I did the first nutrition chapter in Our Bodies, Our Selves. I had already lived communally in a farm in upstate New York. I'd learned a lot about organic farming and gardening, and I knew the importance of good diet and for everybody's health, women's health, everyone's health. And so I saw that as one of the biggest gaps in the early newsprint edition of the book, which is focused mainly on sexual and reproductive health, of course. After I lived communally on a farm, basically not a big farm, but we grew lots of vegetables and had some oats and soy that we grew. I learned how to ride a tractor there. I moved back and lived communally in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a group of mostly academics. And one of the men in our commune was in a men's group with a group of maybe 6, 7 men. One of them was married to Jane Pincus, who was one of the very original people in Our Bodies, Our Cells that did the newsprint edition. And so he said, why don't you go visit this group? Because I was very interested in nutrition. He showed me the newsprint booklet. And sure enough, I went to some of the meetings. These were fluid meetings, people coming in and out. And I loved the group. I loved what the focus was. And I decided I would work on the next nutrition chapter. And that's how I just continued to meet. The group met every week. And
what did that look like? It was a meeting in someone's home? It was
yes.
casual
the meetings
speakers?
The meetings were always held in someone's home. This is very much, the early women's movement, consciousness raising days. People would meet in homes. When Our Bodies, Our Cells founders were in that process of leading community discussions, because once people figured out, this is important information. It grew out of actually a conference, a women's liberation conference that was held at Emmanuel College in the spring of 1969. The women realized that there was so much that they needed to know. They couldn't put together a good doctor's list for Boston, even though they'd all had frustrating experiences because they were so ignorant themselves. So this process of self-education started in early, actually it started throughout 1970. And I met the group in 1971. And the newsprint edition that was called Women and Their Bodies didn't actually adopt the title Our Bodies, Our Cells till 1971.
What does a newsprint edition
Newsprint
look
edition
like?
means it doesn't have a real cover. It's just newsprint paper. And it was
Stapled
about
in the middle,
100
and it's
sort
like
of
a
stapled,
pamphlet sort of thing.
112 pages. That was produced after the women had continued to meet following the Women's Liberation Conference and started this process of self-education and writing little term papers and reaching out to community women to join the conversation. And yes, some were held in daycare centers or in a church basement or at MIT where someone's husband was on faculty, wherever they could find space, classroom, whatever, sometimes in people's homes. And then people kept wanting these materials and wanted to meet and talk about these various issues, whether it was childbirth, postpartum depression, abortions, which were illegal at that point, the bad postpartum depression that someone had. And at that point in time, we weren't recognizing postpartum depression. There were lots of issues. Sexuality was enormous. Women and men knew very little about female sexual response, and we were trying to define these things in ways that really reflected our experience. It was the beginning of combining information that you can gather through, systematic scientific inquiry and maybe research, combined with your own experiences. It's fact and feeling. It's the knowledge you gain from research, which mostly hadn't been done on women in those days, and your knowledge about your own body because you're living in that body.
Did you have a sense that you were at the beginning of something big?
I didn't. I think other women in the group did. I'm not the kind of person who thinks ahead 10, 20 years, but there were a few women in the group who thought this is going to be a phenomenal project that will go far. Once we had this newsprint booklet, because everyone was sick of using the Gestetner machine to make these mimeographs up over and over again, the women in the group went to the New England Free Press, which was this radical underground sort of publisher of materials. The men in the New England Free Press did not think that the content was radical enough, but the women there did, and they agreed to publish as long as the women in the Our Bodies, Our Cells group, and we were called the Boston Women's Health Book Collective then, would put up the money for the printing, which they did, something like $700, $800. And that little booklet sold word of mouth, 200 to 250,000 copies within a couple of years. That tells you something about the hunger for this kind of information. Nothing like it was out there. And it was that got commercial publishers interested. And in late 71, early 72, we were deciding between Simon & Schuster and Random House, who were both vying for contract. And we went with Simon & Schuster because we were able to obtain what exists to this day, a 70% clinic copy discount, so that any nonprofit entity that does health counseling as part of its mission and has a 501c3 could get the book 70% off. The only condition is you could not resell, could give them away. And that made the book available to many low-income women. And we were very pleased that we wrote that into our contract and that it's still available to this day.
So you were in your early 20s when you got involved with this group.
Yes.
And you are still involved. So you've grown up. Your life has been with this organization.
Yes, that's actually true. I was 23 when I first started meeting with the women in Our Bodies, Our Cells and became part of the group. I was part of the core group of 12 women who actually incorporated in early 72 to sign a contract with Simon & Schuster. And over the years, many of us volunteered time, but over the years, some of us worked more and worked for pay. And I worked in many aspects of the organizational activities, and sometimes I did the finances, sometimes I was researching a topic. We were very much a self-directed group. We were a collective. We did incorporate, we did have a 501c3, and eventually as we started to get more and more foundation money, we had to adopt a more conventional model of management with a community board of directors. Initially, we had people from the original collective on the board of directors, but gradually over time, we changed that. So where we have been for more than a decade has been with nobody in the original founder group on the board of directors, although we have a founder liaison who always comes and is part of the meetings and sometimes reports back to the founder group. And the founder group tries to meet every year or two. And it does retain the right, if the board decides at any point in time not to produce Our Bodies, Our Cells, there was an agreement that the founder group would have the right to take that over. It may happen, although we may all be dead and buried before that moment comes. But we're struggling within the organization now as the internet becomes the key place for this kind of information. Does a print version of the book make as much sense now as it did years ago? The 2011 edition is still highly valued. It's been praised a lot and it's used in courses, but we're open to the possibility that the book may not see many more editions in print.
So you've had to be flexible over the decades as the scenario changed with public absorption of information. You've had to change as well.
Absolutely. I think Our Bodies, Our Cells has been the gold standard for evidence-based information about women's health and sexuality across the lifespan. Originally, when we first got going, we were not too impressed with the evidence that was there for lots of things done routinely, whether it was a episiotomy or a cesarean section or all the routine hysterectomies, the use of psychotropic drugs, particularly things like Valium and Librium, tricyclic antidepressants. We learned later that there were few good data to support the massive use of drugs and surgical procedures that were used so much of the time. And it was our increasing contact with people in the public health field and with epidemiologists that educated us, as largely a group of lay women, that we needed to understand those aspects, not just what we saw in the medical literature. And of course, those who know what the Cochrane collaboration is about know that Archie Cochrane gave obstetrics and gynecology the wooden spoon way back when he started this whole endeavor into pushing for more evidence-based medicine and practice. And we know full well that evidence-based medicine is not the be-all and end-all for decision-making, but it's an important piece of the picture, and we all want to know what evidence is out there for, say, a routine practice that we see in medicine, and certainly for women's health, because of the Women's Health Initiative, which was NIH funded, and many other studies that have been carried out over the last few decades. We've learned a lot, and we've got much better database for what we do in obstetrics and gynecology and in other spheres of women's health. Our Bodies, Our Cells was one of the major voices calling for the Office of Research on Women's Health, and one of our advisory board members, Dr. Vivian Pinn, has been a really wonderful ally in pushing the envelope on getting certain important areas researched on behalf of women, looking at gender bias in research and those kinds of things, not just in terms of what we study, but also in terms of who gets to do the research. women as researchers experienced a lot of discrimination, and so NIH has been looking at that over the years. We've been very happy and really gratified to see the number of people in the research community who donated their time to vet sections and materials in Our Bodies, Our Cells, to read chapters, to give their feedback, whether they're clinicians or researchers, public health folks. The quality of all these editions of Our Bodies, Our Cells, especially the 2011 edition, would not be what it is if it weren't for all these volunteers who stepped up to the plate and helped us out.
How long have you been with PRIM&R?
Well, that's a good question. I think I've been on the board 20 years, maybe, or close to that.
So
it's a long time.
Originally, they invited you because?
Well, to be honest, we have actually looked into women's health research at many points in time when we were looking at the trajectory of women's health issues. And there were some things done and research carried out that we were not too impressed with. But we knew nothing about the ethical conduct of research. That wasn't something we'd really thought much about, knew much about. Our real focus was on making abortion safe and legal, access to safe contraception. We wanted to see much more contraceptive research done. And throughout the 70s, we're big advocates for that. I served on the TAC for CONRAD, the Contraceptive Research and Development Program, which was partly USAID funded and partly funded by private foundations. And some wonderful research has been carried out in the realm of contraception. The truth is, for PRIM&R, I knew Joan Racklin through her work defending women's reproductive rights, Moe v. Hanley in Massachusetts, and some other lawsuits that she was involved with, I think even as a law student. And it was the connection to Joan, even before PRIM&R, that led to our friendship and our working on women's health across the gamut of issues. And she asked me if I would be interested at one point in time. I'd had a lot of board experience, and I don't remember our conversation, to be honest, but I know that she's the reason that I looked at PRIM&R and got very interested in what was going on. And there were particular areas where we had common interests and where the women's health research agenda was in sync and certainly was an important topic to bring to the PRIM&R community.
And how was that for you, bringing in the women's issues to the board? And do you feel like you influenced some of the actions or directions that PRIM&R took?
Well, first of all, PRIM&R consists of people who would have a natural interest in many of the issues that we've been interested in Our Bodies, Our Cells. Women's health was a topic of concern to many PRIM&R board members, so that wasn't that I was the only one interested in these issues. Sometimes I could bring more information, contacts, individuals who maybe had done more research or work in the field and would suggest them as speakers, might suggest topics. I was certainly involved more than a decade ago in the early sort of discussions about embryonic stem cell research and the distinctions between somatic cell nuclear transfer and more conventional embryo stem cell research that would use otherwise discarded embryos from, say, IVF clinics. And we had deep concerns about the question of risks taken by young women. You needed fresh eggs to do somatic cell nuclear transfer. And we were deeply concerned that you could not really get what we would call adequate informed consent from these young women, whether it's for the fertility arena or for eggs for research, because we did not know enough about a certain class of drugs, the GnRH agonist antagonists that shut down ovarian functions before you had a controlled hyperstimulation. To this day, we do not have good longitudinal research on the risks to young women's health from undergoing egg extraction, particularly repeatedly and in a short space of time. There is one national voluntary registry based at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, the Infertility Family Research Registry. It's very important. It's not widely publicized. And those in the field of fertility and fertility treatment don't do a very good job of just informing all those involved in ART procedures that this exists, that you can go to the website, sign yourself up, and join a database that would help researchers in the future track better the health of, in our case right now, we're interested in the health of young women. Interestingly enough, we have connected with young women who have been egg donors. or egg providers. I mean, they're not donating eggs, they're getting paid money. But a lot of these young women are now coming together on the internet. A few of them have started a website called weareeggdonors.com, wanting to get better information out there. They feel, as women who came into this process wanting to do good but also needing the money for their graduate education or whatever, that they didn't really get good information about many of the problems that some of them experienced as they underwent egg donation. And it was mostly around the drugs being used. And it wasn't just ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. It was the effects of Lupron, leuprolide acetate, that for some women seemed to throw them into some sort of threshold response where the drug's out of their system, but they're still suffering in a way that nobody really can define or describe. And we have not tracked these young women very well. So the young women themselves are now advocating that other young women, yes, do this if you need the money, be an egg donor, but also join this registry because we need to track our health for the future benefit of young women coming down the pipeline.
What other significant issues in research have affected women over the years? This is one, and this is current. What other ones?
Oh my goodness.
Well, if you could listen,
Oh, there are many. Obviously, we've had a lot of cesarean sections, and I can say that we know now the cesarean section rate has risen. It's now finally coming down because we've been paying more attention to it. But the reasons for many of the cesareans that were done were not adequate, and we've got better documentation of that. We need to come to some place where we are more effectively identifying the women who are the best candidates who are going to really benefit, and not necessarily, for example, going along with totally elective cesareans. Cesarean sections that are done totally for the convenience of women or doctors are associated with worse outcomes for both mother and baby. So there are hospitals now that say you need medical reason. There has to be medical indication for the cesarean for us to say this is okay. You have to defend that choice before you can just go in and plan it and do it. Another is routine use of elective induction. 37, 38 weeks. The assumption was, oh, this isn't such a big sort of issue. Well, as we did more research, we saw that, well, no. We increased the rate of low birth weight, we increased the rate of prematurity. Our NICUs fill up purely as a result of this kind of elective induction without medical reason. And many hospitals now are not allowing that, and we're seeing better outcomes.
Are there actual clinical studies looking into these
particular
instances that you're describing?
This is not something where you're looking at a practice that isn't done and you're going to decide whether you're going to do it. It's not a procedure you're studying. We do inductions all the time. Sometimes we really need to. It is just that became the standard of practice. And institutions, looking at the fact NICUs were filling up and looking at the fact that things weren't looking so good in terms of outcomes, wondering if maybe this isn't such a good idea to allow 37, 38, even 39-week inductions purely for elective reasons. And so these are generally internal assessments. I know that in a hospital in Florida where I spent some time after the production of Our Bodies, Ourselves, Pregnancy and Birth, which is a great single topic book we did. It was a labor and delivery nurse who brought it to the attention of the chief of OBGYN who said, you may have a point here. Let us study our hospital and what we're doing. And they studied it for a year, and the conclusion was, yes, this is one of the reasons our NICU has been teeming, and we can do something really important here by limiting the numbers of medically unindicated inductions of labor, and they did get better outcomes. So I think it's mostly been an internal process, and then of course ACOG has gathered some of this information and done more systematic reviews. But we are seeing finally a reduction in the number of medically unindicated inductions of labor. And there are other examples. One of my favorite examples is the fact that for many women who would be going in for a needed hysterectomy, removal of their uterus, there would also be an oophorectomy done at the same time. The assumption being that, well, you're not having any more kids, and what are your ovaries but organs there to contract cancer, let's avoid ovarian malignancies and we'll just take your ovaries out. And it was assumed this was the right thing to do. A letter from a woman in Canada who had written a menopause newsletter for some years called A Friend Indeed to a gynecologist at UCLA in Los Angeles, a man named William Parker, got him to thinking about whether or not what they were doing routinely, thinking it was the best thing, was in fact the best thing, because they didn't have any good data supporting this practice. So he joined up with other researchers, and they did 2 sets of studies actually, which concluded that the routine removal of ovaries in a woman undergoing, say, a needed hysterectomy did more harm than good. These are very good studies. And you would save a small number of women from getting ovarian cancer, but you know what you produced? You produced very large numbers of women who had cardiovascular disease. They would have hip fractures and awful sequelae as a result because you had taken ovaries out prematurely. And something like almost 1,000 women would be harmed for 46 or 7 women to prevent ovarian cancer in a group of 10,000 women they followed, something like that. Those numbers might not be quite right. Those are stark figures. And what was interesting is that Bill Parker, when he did the first set of studies and did some grand rounds around the country, did not see much significant change in GYN practice until a second set of studies were released, reviewing literature and publishing again. I think he partnered with folks at Brigham and Women's Hospital for the second round. And then finally in the next few years we saw a real downturn in the medically unindicated unnecessary removal of women's ovaries. So there's an example where we didn't have a good evidence base. We finally got it, and we are changing practice.
What are the kinds of things a woman should consider by the nature of her being female when she's trying to decide to be part of a research study?
Well, obviously there are many, many questions here, and we've got NIH meetings, Office of Research on Women's Health, had a whole set of meetings devoted to pregnant women in clinical trials. We don't want to be too paternalistic, and we don't want to say, no pregnant woman in clinical trial. One of the reasons being that sometimes pregnant women need to take some of these drugs for life-saving purposes, and if we have no data at all on how it might impact them, this is a problem. Now, obviously, if you have a wanted child and you're carrying a fetus and there's a potential for teratogenic effect, you have to be really careful. But there are examples of situations where, the data, say animal data, are not strong and it's a theoretical risk, and there could be a really compelling benefit for such a woman to be in a clinical trial. We just have to be a little bit more flexible, careful but flexible. And I think there are many women who would want to be enrolled in a clinical trial that might, in fact, involve taking a drug, for example. So we're looking at that in a more nuanced way. But the problem we have right now is that we are bathed in toxics. We've got xenoestrogens in the, water we drink, in the food we eat sometimes. We've got all kinds of exposures to toxics and things that lock into estrogen receptor cells that are so potent in terms of confounding variables that I think it's very difficult to do some of the research we'd like to do. That you just can't think of, say, a hormone that's exogenously administered as being the only influence on that woman's life. She's got all these other estrogenic-like compounds that are having an impact on her life, maybe her fetus, maybe her children, household compounds, the cleaning products, all kinds of things that we use, personal care products that touch the skin, touch our hair. Many of these have very questionable components. So it's very difficult to do research in such a way that eliminates all the confounding variables out there. And I think it's a real challenge to get at the answer of some of the questions we have now. But we should keep paying attention to the fact that when women get pregnant, to the extent it's possible, it would be nice to minimize assaults on the fetus to the extent we can. And we do know some of these. I remember the what was it that we used for skin? Accutane. we didn't have strong enough warnings, and we had some awful outcomes when pregnant women took Accutane. This was even worse than the earlier crisis we had with
Thalidomide.
That's it. See, this is my brain doing. We know thalidomide did damage, and we know that we wanted to avoid using thalidomide during pregnancy. With Accutane, we actually had a far greater risk, something like 30 to 35% increased risk of serious birth defects and really bad outcomes from using Accutane during particularly the early stages of pregnancy. We weren't doing a good job of making sure that young women who might get pregnant or who did get pregnant were not taking Accutane. So there are examples like that where we've got good data and we really should go, the full 9 yards and make sure that we're avoiding exposure because we got the good data there. And there are times when we don't do as good a job when we've got the evidence and we need to protect the public better. And so we need to put more energy when we've got the data. Something like Accutane is a good example. I also think that we've got certainly a lot to learn about many of the practices in the ART field, assisted reproductive technology, particularly the suppression of ovarian function coupled with hyperstimulation of the ovaries. A lot we have yet to learn there for subsequent problems that may or may not be occurring. One thing I will tell you, this is one of the reasons why we support the Infertility Family Research Registry, want more longitudinal research here, is that anecdotally we're hearing from many women now in their 30s who did 2, 3, sometimes 4 times multiple egg extraction techniques when they were younger in graduate school and now find themselves infertile, going back to fertility centers who are telling them, yes, we're seeing more of you now, those of you who gave eggs before needing our services, and we are here to help you. Well, that's good they're here to help them, but we need to know more about, well, is this a cohort of young women, they're healthy when they started out, who are damaging their future reproductive capacity because they're doing maybe several times of egg extraction in a row, maybe doing it once. I mean, we just don't know enough, and we need to track their health better.
Other than ART issues, what other serious challenges do you think affect women in the future with regards to research?
Well, I think that we are looking more carefully at the long-term use of psychotropic drugs. We know now that some women who are severely depressed postpartum are a big threat to their newborns because they cannot cope. They cannot take care of the baby. And we do know that some of those women need lots of attention and care. Sometimes it's human support. Sometimes it might be a psychotropic drug. It might be some sort of antidepressant. We need to continue tracking the health of offspring as well as the ability of these women to function well. I think we need more research on the whole phenomenon of tapering off, because many people do want to taper off from a variety of drugs that may be helping them, because we're beginning to learn that long-term use of some of these drugs can harm them in other ways in terms of their long-term health. So that's one thing. And we see use of diet drugs, long-term use of diet drugs wreaking havoc on some women's health and well-being. We need some good studies there. We've pulled some drugs off the market when we saw them doing severe damage to women's hearts. Some of that we're not going to know till post-marketing surveillance, but to the extent we can do better in longitudinal research early on, that would be great. I think one of the problems is that we sometimes see ourselves using drugs and hormones when we're not conferring maximum benefit and maybe actually introducing significant harm. One important area where we need better research, but we already have some pretty darn good research, has to do with hormone use around the perimenopause. And the Women's Health Initiative findings are really still quite solid. There's been an attempt to discredit them and an attempt to sort of roll us backwards and to resell estrogens and hormones in ways that are not very productive. We need to be really much more nuanced and careful in how we look at the data and how we do studies going forward. The Women's Health Initiative is still a very good set of studies, and we have learned a lot from them that still stand in good stead for those of us here. There are also things we're learning about bioidentical hormones. We have an FDA-approved product that helps women who are using progesterone, a progesterone-only approach to dealing with really severe hot flashes when they're in a category of women who may want to avoid estrogen use for some reason or another. We are trying to teach the public to steer clear of the term ERT. Federal government already does that at the NIH website. We call it hormone therapy, not HRT, hormone replacement therapy, because that idea that you must replace hormones is an outdated one. Sometimes we need hormones, and we need them to be used judiciously for sometimes short periods of time. They really help enormously. But we don't want to foster this idea that we get to a certain point in our lives and we absolutely have to replace those hormones. And there are some challenges out there. There's a film not very well done called Hot Flash Havoc that many researchers have really not been happy with because it misrepresents the Women's Health Initiative, and it doesn't present a balanced view the way many researchers would like. And so we've got to sometimes offset some of these more popularized appeals that don't take the best of research and present it to women, but give a really pat, misleading, sometimes cutified answer to questions women have.
I could imagine that your role on the board of PRIM&R is to bring the female perspective to research. But is that the case or not?
Not at all. I think that my role on the PRIM&R board has been a lot around organizational development, a little bit about how to advance the discussion in one way or another. I was one of the people who wanted to do socially responsible investment more than 10 years ago, and that was a process that, the board went through. I was one of the people who wanted to see term limits on the board, and I have experience in other settings. I was on the board of the Greater Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra, now Boston Youth Symphony Orchestras, and we went through a very difficult process where people objected to term limits, and I learned something from that, and I brought that experience to the PRIM&R board. So I think some of it is around just being a good board member. I do know some things about women's health research, but it isn't primarily my input that's really benefited our agenda at the PRIM&R conferences. PRIM&R has a gigantic community of people in all kinds of fields who bring to the table rich experience with monitoring research, carrying out research, wanting to advance ethical conduct in research. And we've had amazing speakers. Some of our speakers, like Susan Reverby, are longtime friends of mine, and she goes back to the very early editions of Our Bodies, Our Cells and her involvement with Our Bodies, Our Cells. So we do point to those individuals who've been involved with Our Bodies, Our Cells, and they're involved with PRIM&R. But I'm not necessarily the link to that work and PRIM&R. Sometimes it was somebody else.
In your experience with PRIM&R, what trend or growth have you seen that you think is important for the organization?
Well, I would say that we've brought a level of professional management to the organization. We have a staff that is so stellar, it would be the envy of most organizations I know. We have an amazing staff. I joke sometimes with my friends outside of PRIM&R that, occasionally we have the token male. Sometimes we're even without a male on the staff. And I used to say, if we were an organization that depended on foundation income, we would be in trouble because they would look at our board and say they would look at our staff and say we discriminate against men. And it's just fascinating because I've been involved in many nonprofits where diversity on the staff and the board have been critical factors for whether you will get funds from foundations. The PRIM&R board lacked a lot in terms of diversity at one point in time. It got better, still not where it needs to be, but it has been focusing on that. The staff has certain level of diversity, but in terms of sex diversity, I think right now we're not doing that well. But it's very true that this organization and this staff seeks out the best people, and I think it's been simply a fact that the best people coming up for these jobs so far have been women. We've certainly hired men, but for me that's a source of joking around with my friends who aren't part of PRIM&R, because I think it's the only organization I know where with the exception of Our Bodies, Ourselves, where we have only women on the staff. People don't really raise their eyebrows at that. We have a very small staff, much smaller than the PRIM&R staff. But our board at Our Bodies, Ourselves has several male board members. That was important to me. It took some time to make that happen. Our foundation fundraisers were more interested in ethnic diversity, diversity in terms of sexual preference and other age, less initially in terms of sex diversity, but that too. I think that PRIM&R's board as well, it benefits from a lot of diversity, and we should all be paying attention to that. I do think that it's going to be a big challenge to make the transition to a new executive director, insofar as many people have depended upon Joan for a certain kind of leadership. We're going to all have to be open to someone slightly different, maybe radically different in some ways, being a good leader for PRIM&R. Because we have this amazing staff which will support a new leader, I think it will be a smooth transition. But I think the board and the other members of the leadership who plan conferences have to be ready for someone with a slightly different vision for PRIM&R. It doesn't mean it will be any worse, but it will be slightly different. So we have to be not so rigid in our expectations. I think that will be one challenge. But actually, for an organization that is financially as stable as PRIM&R is, that has a very conscientious and hardworking board, has a terrifically talented staff, I think PRIM&R can look ahead with a lot of confidence at this point in time.
It seems that the man on the street doesn't truly understand the research process and the review process and how subjects are protected and what protections are in place. What do you think is the most important thing for that general population person to understand about research and review?
Well, everything that's important to the ethical conduct of research, at least the 101 version, really needs to be conveyed to the public. And I say the American public because I think we have an educational system that probably has the capacity to do that. The leadership for this effort has to come from people within the field and from educators who understand increasingly the central role that medical research is playing, and that we need an educated public, not just because then you have more responsible participation in clinical trials, but you also understand what the research means, its potential, and you can both participate in it and critique it with a little more knowledge. That kind of basic education has to happen beginning, I think, in middle school, not even high school. The ideas have to be introduced. I think we have to have really basic curriculum modules developed by people who are in the research community, but design it for use by biology teachers and even middle school teachers who are interested in making young people more aware of these issues. It could be a great project for some of the interns at PRIM&R. It could be a great project for some of the people who come to PRIM&R conferences. I know that Eric Lander, who's been very interested in teaching about genomics and genetics to young people, has been involved in developing some of these curriculum materials. And before, when he was at Whitehead, now the Broad Institute, he partnered with some very interesting people to do public television, and maybe we could do something similar to bring some of the important sort of foundational concerns around ethical conduct of research to the forefront in teaching young people about why this is important. Many of these young people want to go into medicine. They'll want to go into research at some point, and it's good to have them thinking about this, thinking about conflicts of interest, for example. In my own work in women's health, in my own work on college campuses, I see tremendous lack of understanding around the importance of identifying conflicts of interest, eliminating them when possible, but at least appreciating how they play a central role. And many people, I'd say the majority of the American public, are clueless about the roles that such conflicts play.
If you were going to imagine the future, let's say the next 50 years of research on this planet globally, so we're thinking large scale here, what do you think is a danger or concern that we face?
I think we already know that much of the research that's carried out in less industrialized countries, where the infrastructure is not in place, where the oversight is not in place, paperwork might be carried out as we like. But the paperwork, we've even seen it in this country. The paperwork may not reflect what's happening on the ground. That we have to be much more rigorous in ensuring that the rules we expect to be followed in the research setting do get followed. That the kind of informed consent we expect is happening does in fact happen. I know from some of our colleagues at the Our Bodies, Our Cells global initiative who follow research in their own communities in poor settings across the world that sometimes the research, which has a good set of protocols, is not what's actually happening on the ground. So I've been deeply concerned that we build in place the resources that we need to have proper oversight. If we don't do this, then research will backfire horribly. We saw that with the HPV vaccine. This was post-marketing research, but the way in which some of the research was carried out in parts of India regarding the HPV vaccine really showed a horrible lack of adequate oversight and really, I think, set back the whole endeavor of research, because in the minds of many of those families, researchers are not to be trusted as a result of what happened. We've seen that over and over again in many different settings. So I think we should take the time and raise the money to do it properly and not get so excited and carried away by the importance of doing this here and now and not waiting for the resources to be in place to do it properly. Because if we give research a bad name, then individuals, whether they're in the United States or in other countries, will not want to participate in the research because of something bad they saw happen to someone they know in their community as a result of poorly conducted research.
Does PRIM&R have a role in addressing this potential danger, this ongoing danger?
Well, let me say one of the most exciting things to me as a PRIM&R board member over the last 15, 20 years has been to watch the increasing engagement of folks interested in doing research in other countries, and the degree to which we have provided scholarships. We have brought people to our conferences. We've had people on the PRIM&R board and on our PRIM&R community take their time to go to other countries, to do one-on-one courses, to be part of conferences in other countries, to provide their expertise, their knowledge, right there in settings where it's most needed. And I think this is going to yeast. This is going to really build a community of knowledgeable, ethically driven researchers like nothing else. And PRIM&R has really taken the lead on this, and I'm very proud of PRIM&R for that.